You're listening to LeaderCast, episode 79. Welcome to LeaderCast, Transforming Missions podcast with Tim Bias and Sara Thomas, providing you with insights and resources you need to lead a movement of Jesus followers.
Sara, last week I watched a baseball game between the Cincinnati Reds and Pittsburgh Pirates. Toward the end of that game, there was a bench emptying brawl, a fight. The players from both teams came rushing out on the field, fists flying, wrestling one another to the ground. They were pushing, they were shoving, they were shouting obscenities. It actually took the umpires, the coaches, those who weren't fighting, players and security several minutes to restore order. Finally, when peace was restored, the game resumed. Now, the reason for the brawl. There were accusations made by both managers that the opposing pitchers were throwing the baseballs directly at their batters' heads. Then the accusation was made that the opposing manager instructed the pitcher to intentionally throw at a batter. And when one pitcher hit a batter, words, obscenities, were exchanged, not only among the players, but with one manager and an umpire. And I suppose you can only take so much. So to defend his teammates, who was being accused of such action, so the pitcher rushed the dugout of the Pirates, and this led to both teams rushing out on the field and engaging in a baseball fight, which traditionally is called a brawl. So after the game, several of the players involved in the fight were interviewed by the media, and it was interesting. And this is maybe the whole story. This is what's interesting to me. One player said his emotions got the best of him. Another player said he was taking up for his teammates. And another player said, well, I really didn't have a choice. We're a team and we stick together as a team. Now, even though there were some apologies made, those involved in the brawl really never admitted that they were wrong or that they had made mistakes, except maybe the one guy, the pitcher, who actually started the brawl. Really, they blamed everyone from the league management for not addressing the issue of throwing at batters, to the opposing managers for ordering pitchers to intentionally throw at batters, and the poor guy who says, well, we're a team and we stick together as a team. What made the interviews interesting to me was that each player interviewed, regardless of motivation to enter the brawl, implied that they were following someone's lead. Now, I'm sure by now everybody listening is wondering, what does a baseball brawl have to do with leadership? Well, today we're focusing not upon a fight or a brawl, but upon becoming a wholehearted, integrated leader. And I think that's probably enough for me to set up this session. So this episode, what would you add?
All that I would add at this point is I was also watching that game, and Tim and I were actually texting one another after the game around these interviews, and my immediate response was, this is a case study in shame and blame. And so we'll get into that some and how that relates to the life of a leader in the local church and what you all are seeking to do in your communities. So before we get there, let me remind you that this episode of LeaderCast is brought to you by Dare to Lead, a training experience for Christian leaders to learn the skills you need to be a brave leader and create a courageous culture at church, at home, and in the workplace. It's just one way that we help you as a leader to deepen your relationship with Christ, your congregation, and your local community. You can find resources for this episode at transformingmission.org/079. And I'll remind you now and again at the end of the episode, if you haven't already done so, subscribe to be a LeaderCast Insider and subscribe to LeaderCast on your favorite podcast player. If you're an insider, you'll get all of the goodness first before anybody else knows that the episode is even out there. So now, let's jump into becoming a wholehearted leader. And Tim, I know that over the course of the past few weeks, you've been reading/listening to a book by the title of Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me. And so from this experience of a bench clearing brawl in the middle of a professional baseball game to a book that explored a whole lot of different dimensions of life and work and leadership around this idea of mistakes were made, but not by me. Can you tell us what that was about and help us take the next step in this conversation around becoming a wholehearted leader?
Well, number one, I just like saying the name of the book. Mistakes were made, but not by me. And we may want to refer people to the book sometime. But as I was...
I'll put a link in the show notes. Excuse me.
As I was reflecting upon the brawl, I began to think about the influence each of us has as leaders. Because the book is really about why we try to justify beliefs, bad decisions, hurtful acts. And for me, that's what really gets in the way of being what we're calling a wholehearted leader or an influential leader.
So are you saying that the bench clearing brawl between the Cincinnati Reds and the Pirates, there may have been some justification of foolish behavior or beliefs or bad decisions or hurtful acts, and maybe even that happens in the life of the church? Is that where you're taking us?
That's exactly what I'm saying. Because as I began to think about the book and relationship to the brawl, I said, this is really where we are as the church right now. But some things that come out of the book in terms of how I read it is that none of us can avoid making mistakes, but we do have the ability to say, this isn't working here, this doesn't make sense, and begin to make different choices. One of the things I grew up hearing, I think it's a saying that we hear all the time, is to err is human. But humans, you and I, have a choice between covering up and fessing up. So the choice we make is crucial to what we might do next. And we're forever being told that we should learn from our mistakes. But here's something you and I've talked about on more than one episode. How can we learn from our mistakes unless we first admit that we've made mistakes?
We're all going to make mistakes, or we're going to be paralyzed. Huh. So viewing mistakes as a natural part of being human and recognizing what you just said, how we respond to them makes all of the difference is where we're heading.
Part of the book points out that as human beings, we're created with the ability to protect ourselves, and where it becomes unhealthy is that when we can learn and become more who we might become because we're willing to admit we've made some mistakes or we have failed in some way. What we do is really double down to protect what we've done, not admitting anything, but continuing to live within a kind of a falsehood of reality.
Would you say that when they were writing about that, what they were really talking about was our ego?
They didn't say that directly, but yes, I think that's exactly what it is, because we're trying to protect our certainties, our self-esteem, our affiliation. So if we have to say that we've made a mistake, then there's somewhere, yes, ego has a lot to do with it.
And I asked that question because one of the things that, as I was studying with Brené Brown and have been working on preparing this Dare to Lead training for our pastors and our leaders in the district, our ego is an eager and willing conspirator when it comes to taking our heart and locking it up. And when I say that, I'm not just talking about our emotion, I'm talking about the core of our soul and who we are. Because as we talk about being a wholehearted leader, it's really about integrating our whole self. It's about integrating our thoughts, our feelings, and our actions. And if our ego is the one that is driving all of our actions, it's going to lead to some things, and you're going to tell us what those things are. It leads to not being healthy, but it also leads to us protecting ourselves, and you're going to walk us through a few things there.
Well, this list, part of it comes out of the book, but listen to it in the context of a baseball brawl, or listen to it in the context of what might be going on in the church right now. Because when we're not healthy, this self-protection or self-justification leads to prejudice. It distorts our memory. We start reconstructing history so it proves that we have been right. It turns our confidence into arrogance. It continues to create and perpetuate injustice. And even in the church, we use the scriptures even as a way to protect ourselves and what we believe. It warps love, because then what we talk about is, well, we're doing this out of love, and it generates feuds and rifts. So, I don't know about you, but this sounds pretty familiar to me. It happens on baseball diamonds, in clubhouses, at sports stadiums. And I think in part of our conversation, you were pointing out something that you say it very well. I want you to say it again.
As we were talking both about what happened between the Reds and the Pirates this week, what we see happening in the church and the challenges that some of our pastors face, there's no some in that. It's everyone. And I'm not saying everyone just for the sake of throwing an umbrella. We all experience it. And part of what I began to see because of what happened in Cincinnati is that this isn't a challenge for church leaders. This is a challenge for human beings, because we have not learned the skills of leadership to lead in a different way. And when we default to our ego-driven self, which is our primal being, I'm going to give you this metaphor. We use armor to protect ourselves. And there's different behaviors that can come about with that armor. But this isn't a challenge for our church. This isn't a challenge for Major League Baseball. This isn't even just a challenge for our government or for businesses or for the media or for education. Pick any industry you want to pick. And it is a challenge that we are experiencing in the world today as human beings. And so what we want to do for the rest of this episode is to give you 3 examples of armored leadership and 3 examples of daring leadership that invite you to step into what it means to be a wholehearted leader. And let me remind you again that a wholehearted leader is about integration. It's about bringing what you're thinking, what you're feeling, as well as your actions together. It means that you're going to lead in a way that encourages and models daring leadership. And it's a whole different way of being, because what I hope as we walk through these 3 behaviors of daring leadership and armored leadership, that you will begin to see that if you want to influence people, and if we want to lead in a different way, and I hope that we do as a church, because I see the possibility for the church and for our pastors and for our leaders in our local churches to help model a different way of not only leading, but model a different behavior so that people can take the skills that they're seeing modeled for them, that they're encountering, the conversations that they're having in different ways to their families, to their places of employment, to the other volunteer organizations that they're a part of, and to your community. So what does it mean to be a wholehearted leader in the midst of all of the chaos that we might feel like that we're experiencing, in the midst of rapid change? I wish I could remember what the statistics were. Someone I saw in social media yesterday, someone posted the rate at which it took people to adopt moving to the printing press, moving to the telephone, and now the technology that is changing. Instead of being decades or centuries, we're now talking hours and days. Things are changing quickly, and so that's requiring us to lead in a different way and adapt to what's happening around us. Again, it doesn't change our values. It doesn't change who we are as people of faith. It means responding in a different way. So wholehearted leadership is about cultivating the courage, compassion, and connection to integrate our thinking, feeling, and behavior. It's about putting down what Brené Brown calls armor and bringing forth all the pieces of what makes us who we are: the good, the bad, the ugly, the messy, the complex, and the admirable. So armor shows up in things like perfectionism, emotional stoicism, hustling 24/7 for our worth. And the hard part about armor, well, it is part of our natural human nature, our fallen human nature. It creates compartments in our lives, and it imprisons the heart. And in the process, it kills courage. And courage is the very thing that we need as leaders in the midst of chaos and in the midst of the changing times that we're experiencing. So, yeah, our heart may keep blood pumping through our bodies, but it also keeps vulnerability coursing through our veins. So let's walk through these 3 armored leadership and daring leadership examples. Let me name the 3 examples of armored leadership, and then we'll walk through them one by one and give you the daring leadership response and talk about how it might have been different on the baseball field as well as in the life of the church. And I'm going to offer 3 today, but from the research that Brené Brown and her team did over the past decade, they've identified 16 behaviors that get in the way of daring leadership. We're only going to cover 3. If you want to learn more about the other 13, you can come and participate in one of the Dare to Lead workshops, and we'll walk through them and help you to see how you can begin to lead in a different way. So the first one is propagating the false dichotomy of victim or Viking, crush or be crushed. The second armored leadership behavior is weaponizing fear and uncertainty. And the third one we're going to talk about is zigzagging and avoiding. To jump into propagating the false dichotomy of victim or Viking, crush or be crushed, You love saying mistakes were made, but not by me. That's the one that I love saying. The false dichotomy of victim or Viking, crush or be crushed. So what's this about? This is about setting up a binary world of paired opposites. You're either the sucker or loser who always gets the short end of the stick, or you're the Viking who refuses to be victimized. So, how'd that happen on a baseball diamond this week?
Well, I think we saw some Vikings.
I think we may have. There was no way for some of those players, and they even said it in the interviews afterwards, that they were going to put up with what they were seeing. They were going to come out on top.
Right.
So how does that unfold in the life of the church? Where do we see that happening?
Sometimes when people don't get their way, and it may be even good, but if they don't get their way, then they begin to withhold their money.
There's one.
So there's a place there that, okay, I can show you. That may not be what they're thinking, but that's what they're doing.
Right.
Another place, and this is part of our culture, but it's not a way of dismissing it. And that is, it just seems like that if somebody wants a change, they have to have somebody to be that they can blame. So somebody made, just using the language that we've done, somebody made some mistakes, and I'm angry, so I'm going to quit. They really want to quit anyway.
Right.
So instead of just being honest about it, what they do is they're going to blame somebody so somebody else can take the responsibility for their action.
So they're not the victim. They can be the Viking in the midst of it, because we haven't set up a way for those individuals who have served faithfully, many of them for years, to say, my season in serving in this way is done. And so they feel victimized and blamed for not being a good leader because they're not continuing, which is silly and stupid, but it is what happens. So there's a different way that we can respond, and that's the daring leadership response. And that involves practicing integration. Strong back, soft front, wild heart. Integration is about the act of bringing together all the parts of ourselves, as we talked about earlier. It means that we're going to be tough, but we're also going to be tender. It means that there are going to be times that we're going to be scared and we're going to be brave all at the same time. It means that we're going to be people of grace, but we're also going to be people who have grit. It means that we're going to be grounded and centered. So when I think about what happened between the Reds and the Pirates, there was nothing about that was grounded. There was nothing about that was calm, cool, and collected, if I can say it that way. It was the complete opposite. So, Tim, as we were having conversation, Tim, you offered a different response to what happened on the baseball diamond this week. What would be another scenario instead of a pitcher charging the dugout of another team? What might have been a different response, or a manager screaming in an umpire's face?
Well, the question I ask and that's in the light of courageous or brave leadership, was what would happen if the manager, and because since I'm a Reds fan, we'll pick on David Bell. What would have happened if he had said to the team, we're not going out on the field until we get this resolved? So instead of charging the other dugout, what would have happened if they'd gone into the clubhouse and said, we're not coming out? Now, it may be that they lost the game. It may be that the manager would have been suspended. Oh, he's been suspended for 6 games anyway for fighting. Does that make him a better manager? Does that make him a better leader? And I'm going to say only for entertainment purposes, but not for the reality of what it is to be a leader.
No, your scenario, we don't know what would happen. We can only play that out in our imagination. But let's shift it to the local church in terms of a different response, practicing integration, to the example that you offered of withholding money. So if we are people who are integrated in our leadership, strong back, soft front, wild heart, we're coming into that situation and saying, there are some decisions that are made and have been made that I disagree with, but I think I disagree with them because I probably don't understand how you got there. Can you help me to understand? And at the end of that conversation, there still might be a disagreement about where the decision was made. But if collectively we're focused on the mission of the church, there's room for that disagreement. And it's not about one person winning and another person losing, or one group in the church winning and another group in the church losing. It's about the leadership has made a decision and they've been thoughtful in that. And other people have had the opportunity to offer their insights and their input. And so a decision was made as faithfully as it could be. So we have a conversation about it and we step into it instead of having passive aggressive behavior and saying to our friends, well, I'm going to withhold my money and hold the church hostage so they don't have the resources to be able to do. No. Daring leadership steps into it and says, let's have a conversation. I need to understand, and I need you to know I'm not really happy about what happened. That might not change, but I would like to hear how we got there. Whole different experience begins to unfold. Anything you want to add to that?
Well, it's based upon choice. I mean, we sometimes say to protect ourselves that I really didn't have a choice, and we're in this together.
We always have a choice.
But we do have a choice. And the choice is, this sounds pretty simplistic, and I don't mean for it to, but if we're followers of Jesus, our choice is always a bit different than the way of the self-protection and self-justification.
And I feel like I've been doing this every episode now for the past few. We could have a whole conversation around how, as people of faith, do we integrate faith into all of our decisions? Because you may have just named one of our biggest challenges. That because we've had a hard time doing that, we default to what we're talking about today in terms of the armored leadership instead of stepping into the daring leadership. Because the way that I look at it is if we're people of faith, no, we might not know what happens, but I'm stepping into whatever is happening with faith, with the trust that Jesus is present in the midst of what we are experiencing. And I'm seeking to follow him as faithfully and with as much grace as I possibly can. We don't always see that. It does happen, but we don't always see that in the life of the church.
So it'd be really wonderful if we would just set that into motion in terms of what's going on in the church. It would make a huge difference, a huge change. Now, I'm ready to move to the next one, but you stirred that up in my thinking. So
when I think about the binary nature of that victim or Viking, that's the very conversation that we hear so often right now. It's binary. There is not integration happening when the conversation, who am I kidding? It's not even a conversation. When the issues are presented in a binary way and we're focused on the issues. Integration comes when we're focused together on the mission and we recognize that because God has created us in unique and beautiful ways, there's going to be a million ways in a million different contexts that we're going to be able to fulfill that mission. But we've got to be able to listen to one another to get to that place to see, oh, Tim's giftedness brings a whole new element to what it means to lead in this time and place and how that gets lived out. I could say that for anybody, but you get my point. Okay, we'll get off of that one and move on to the next one. The next armored leadership behavior is weaponizing fear and uncertainty. And this one is about if we can keep people afraid, if you can give them an enemy who's responsible for their fear, you can get people to do just about anything. And this is where authoritarian leaders live, and it's what happens, it's the playbook that they go to over and over again. So how was weaponizing fear and uncertainty taking place on the ball diamond, and how does that happen in the life of the church?
I'm jumping to the church, but I'll do the ball diamond first, and that is the idea of throwing at another batter or at their head. And so now we've got to protect our players so they don't get hurt. So what do? We throw at the other team's batters.
Right. So they're not just an opponent; they're an enemy now.
Right. And even to the point that now we're going to blame the opposing team's manager for doing this intentionally.
Right.
So and then when it continues to go on, okay, now I'm going to charge your dugout. I am not going to take your words anymore. We're going to settle this. And the strange thing in the midst of that, which is where I want to jump off for the church, the strange thing in the midst of that is the person who rushed the dugout, in the midst of all the conversation afterwards, it was said about him. The strange thing is that the one who rushed the dugout actually started the brawl. After it was over, the media said, now he has the respect of his teammates.
Alpha male culture.
But when you move that over to the church, it's the same kind of thing, because if you're going to hold a position and your position is that the other people are wrong, then what you're going to do is to continue to villainize them, and even to the point that you're going to step into it and do something really what I'm going to say foolish. And then everybody on the side that you're on are saying, look how good they are because they're taking that stand, and this is what they're doing. It takes us down a path we don't want to go, in my opinion. Did I say that correctly?
Yes. So the daring leadership response is, instead of weaponizing fear and uncertainty, that's the armored leadership, the daring leadership response is acknowledging, naming, and normalizing collective fear and uncertainty. It means that as leaders, we're going to acknowledge, name, and normalize the discord and difference without fueling divisiveness or benefiting from it. It means we're going to step into it and embrace the uncertainty and helping folks know that, no, we don't know how this is going to turn out either, but you're acknowledging that. So as I think about, again, I'm going to go back to the example that you offered in terms of the manager for the Reds, David Bell, saying to his team, you know what, we're not going out there. What is happening on the field right now shouldn't be happening. Pitchers shouldn't be throwing balls at batters' heads. I don't know what's going to happen when I say to the ump, we're not coming out until we address this, but I'm going to ask you to hang tight here in the dugout. I'm going to go have a conversation and we'll see what happens, because I'm not going to put up with any of my players being afraid that a baseball is going to be thrown at their head. Period. You've acknowledged it. You've acknowledged what you don't know. And then you step out and you have the conversation with the umpire. I'll say this about you, Tim, as we have been leading through this time leading up to the general conference that happened this year, and then after that, I think you have modeled this aspect of daring leadership beautifully for the churches in our district by simply saying, look, folks, we don't know where this is going. Yes, we know the decisions that were made earlier in this year, but leading up to that, we didn't. And you were clear of helping folks to be able to say, you know what, here's what we know, here's what we don't know. And then after decisions were made, again, here's what we know, here's what we don't know. And continuing to lead forward and point people towards the mission, not trying to brush over the emotion, the challenges in the midst of that, but simply to name it for folks and to not get hung up in, dare I say, the drama of that fuels the fear and the uncertainty and makes it a weapon instead of allows us to focus on what's happening in our communities. I'm thinking about a conversation that you and I were having about one of our churches, and they're jumping into ministry in their local community, and the comment that was made by one of the leaders that, you know what, they're not even talking about what's happening in the denomination because they're engaged in the ministry in their local context, and they're responding to needs around them, and they're living out what it means to be a follower of Jesus. That's what happens. And I think you've modeled this aspect of daring leadership beautifully in this time of uncertainty for us. So I just want to acknowledge that and celebrate you for modeling that for a whole group of people.
I appreciate you saying that. What I'm thinking is that you particularly, have developed a whole process for us to have conversation within our congregations. And what I'm learning as I have more conversation with people in local churches is that much of the reaction that we have right now is based upon fear. It's the fear that it's not going to turn out the way I want it to. It's the fear that the church that I've known all of my life is changing. It's the fear that somebody's going to have some leadership and that I'm not going to have, and I'm not sure I want it. And so there is this doubling down again, instead of looking at reality and having the conversation like what you've said, being vulnerable. The illustration you had about the manager walking out, talking to the umpire, telling his team to stay in the dugout is much more vulnerable than the team running out on the field, throwing their fists, tackling one another. And the result of something like that would bring much more attention to what the issues are than the fighting.
Right.
But I just wish that in our hearts that we would ask ourselves, is this the way that God's love gets shared with the people around me? And then decide, this is the way I need to respond, or this is the way I need to respond. I don't think we ever that we ever allow God's love to be integrated within us in our decision making as much as we think we do. And I think that's part of what we're talking about.
And I'm just going to let that one sit there for a moment so that those of you that are listening can think about that. Yeah, the last one that we're going to do, and we'll do this one quickly. The armored leadership example is zigzagging and avoiding. Zigzagging is really a metaphor. It's a metaphor for the energy that we spend trying to dodge the bullets of vulnerability, whether it's conflict, whether it's discomfort, whether it's confrontation, or the potential for shame, hurt, or criticism. We do what the word says. We zigzag away from it. I think we've already probably named this as we've been talking about what happened in Cincinnati and talking about what has happened in the life of the church, that, and you just named it before we went on to this one, that we don't stop and ask ourselves the question, is this the most faithful response? Instead, we stay focused on our issue and our stance, and we zigzag around, allowing ourselves to step into that place where we're in a place of vulnerability, and the community that we're a part of is in a place of vulnerability, that we might have an encounter with Jesus that might reach us in a way that we haven't considered before. I think the armored leadership happens in the depths of our souls when we're taking positions and stances on things and not finding ourselves in the place that you were speaking to of, Jesus, what's the faithful response here? What are you inviting me to consider? What are you asking me to do? We zigzag around it. We avoid it. We point fingers. We put up walls. Anything you want to say about the Reds or the church on that one?
Well, I'll go to the church. I think we spent enough time with the Reds and the Pirates. I think sometimes we protect ourselves or armor up from Jesus.
Right. That's exactly what I was saying. You just said it much clearer than I did.
So the reason we do that is because if we do follow Jesus, it may not come out where we want it to. And the illustration that I use sometimes in churches, because I grew up in revivals and things, and the old evangelist would take that picture where Jesus is knocking on the door that doesn't have the doorknob on the outside. And they would always say, Jesus is knocking at the door, and you can only open the door from the inside and let him in. And I think we've misunderstood that picture. I think Jesus is knocking on the door so that if we open it, he says, come on out with me. Because if we let him in, we're still trying to control him. If we follow him into the world, we've got to trust him.
And that leads to the daring leadership response, speaking with clarity and taking action. So if we're going to follow Jesus, we're going to place ourselves in the hands of Jesus, and that's going to mean placing ourselves in a position of vulnerability, because we don't always know where Jesus is going to lead us. It's going to mean that we're going to be willing to say, here's what I understand, here's what I don't understand, here's what I'm mad about, here's what I'm confused about, here's where I've gotten my information, and I don't even know if this information is right. It's just what's been shared with me. And being open to taking the action of perhaps learning something different, or sitting across from someone that sits in a very different place in terms of the position or the issue, but you're both followers of Jesus and you're both a part of the same community, and taking the action to have that conversation of, let's talk about this as people of faith and be present to one another and listen to one another. See how Jesus might transform our lives in the midst of it.
So maybe another way to say that as we come to the end of this episode is, why don't we just be Christian?
Why don't we?
Why don't we just love one another the way we've been loved? And that's not a simplistic, and it's not shallow. It's actually integrating the faith into our lives so that who we are reflects who we follow.
And how I would say it is, I find a beautiful parallel between wholehearted leadership and how that's described as integrating your thoughts, your feelings, your actions, being willing to be present with courage, with compassion, to how Wesley talked about being people who are living out their faith as people of piety as well as people of social holiness. That's integration. When we talk about how are we shaped inwardly and how are we living outwardly, it's another way to speak about how are we integrating our faith into our lives. And at the core of who we are as followers of Jesus in the Wesleyan Methodist tradition, it's about integration. And so I see parallel tracks of what we're talking about here today aligns with the base of our theology of who we are.
Such a great need for wholehearted leaders who can actually influence the people around them because they're people of integrity and they're people that can be trusted.
And so I'll remind you again that if you are interested in being a part of the training experiences that we are doing will begin this fall. You can find a place to sign up to be notified when that goes live on the show notes page at transformingmission.org/079. And if you haven't subscribed to LeaderCast on your favorite podcast player, we encourage you to do so. You'll also find a place to sign up to be a LeaderCast insider on the show notes page, and we'll link to the book that Tim mentioned as well as the resources that I've been talking about from Brené Brown as well. We hope in this episode we've given you a few examples of both daring and armored leadership and invited you to step into being a daring and courageous leader. So go lead a movement of Jesus followers. Bye for now.